Good evening, George. Can you hear me okay?
Good evening.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes till the meeting start time. I'll just reintroduce when we hit 8 o'clock, okay?
Okay, thanks very much.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's meeting with George Galloway and the Workers' Party of Britain. And tonight, the title of our meeting is War Propaganda Incorporated. So I will pass on to you, George. Good evening.
Thank you very much. Good evening to all the comrades of the Workers' Party of Britain and all those watching who are not yet our members, but whom we hope to persuade and, if possible, recruit. The proximate reason for this subject this evening is the extraordinary revelations last week in a document dumped by the group that calls itself Anonymous, which I was one of the recipients of, but the sheer scale of the dump was such I didn't get all that far through it. But that wonderful journalistic outlet based in the United States called the Grey Zone Project, with Ben Norton, Max Blumenthal, Anya Parampil, and other really fine, outstanding journalists, went to work on that document dump and produced a report, which I won't seek to replicate in detail, because I'm hoping that everyone watching this will themselves go and read it on the Grey Zone Project site. And if you want the distilled version, then you can watch Sunday Past's Mother of All Talk Shows. If you haven't already, almost 1 million people have already. And you'll see Ben Norton, the author of the piece, interviewed by me. I'm not going to, as I say, replicate the details, which are breathtaking, frankly. They'll make your hair stand on end. But I am going to talk about what it means for us here in Britain, because the reason why the head chopping, throat cutting, heart eating, gay murdering, woman hating outfits of the so-called Syrian opposition got such a good press in this country for almost a decade, until they demonstrably lost the war and attention turned elsewhere. The reason why they got that press is because we paid for it. By we, I mean the taxpayers of Britain. Just think about that for a moment. Maybe more than 100 million pounds of our money, which could have gone to so many causes, I don't need to adumbrate them for this intelligent audience this evening. We all know what 100 million pounds could have done for our high streets, for our schools, our small businesses, but it was instead spent in secret, the second important point, on building a gigantic public relations machine, better known as a propaganda machine, for the alphabet soup of Islamist extremist organizations working to bring down the secular government in Syria. Most of us were surprised at the way in which our media outlets were able to absolutely overlook the character of the individuals and organizations that we were obviously supporting in the long Syria war, which cost the lives probably of more than 1 million people, caused the displacement of more than 4 million people, some of whom are still living as refugees in God-forsaken accommodation for the most part in our own country and around Europe. We were surprised that nobody during what they used to describe as sieges of rebel-held territory, producing documentaries about the last hospital in Aleppo, snow jobs for some of the worst, literally, cutthroat organizations in the world. Some of us were surprised at that, even by the standards of the lie machine that is Whitehall and Westminster at times of conflict, in terms of how we describe, the narrative we spin of the foreign policy confrontations that we are into. But nobody could prepare you for the details that the Grey Zone and Anonymous have now produced, because we've now got the receipts, and I mean receipts. We've got receipts for millions and millions of pounds going to British intelligence cut-off outfits who were in receipt of this secretly funded money from the British state. It seems like there was a division of labor broadly. The United States provided through their milk cows in the Gulf, of course, they didn't pay for it themselves, but they strong-armed Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates and others to pay for the heavy weaponry. The United States did the training and the entering of special forces into the theater. Britain did a bit of that itself, but Britain's aid was what they call in Whitehall non-lethal aid. But of course, this is a misnomer, because if you are acting as the propaganda wing of people who are cutting other people's heads off, people that merely disagree with the religious interpretation of the Islamist extremists, including many, perhaps mostly other Sunni Muslims, but Shiites and Alawites and Christians by the 100, if not by the 1,000, including Catholic priests and even a bishop, who were beheaded, oftentimes in front of their congregation, by the people that we were acting as the public relations division of. We were literally training and guiding the so-called citizen journalists that were bringing us one propaganda hoax after another. The hoax personified by the white helmets, who went all the way to the Oscars, where on stage with a handkerchief in hand, they thanked everyone who'd helped them on their way up, except the people who had helped them the most, which is us, the British taxpayer. The British state was up to its neck in a fake chemical weapons attack, Canard, in Douma, D-O-U-M-A. Some people have forgotten about it now, but some of us never will. A chemical weapons attack that was staged, filmed, reported, propagandized for by the very public relations division that we were funding. And it almost took the world into World War III. It caused a blizzard of cruise missiles costing billions of dollars to be landed all over Syria as a kind of retaliation for a chemical weapons attack that never actually happened. In fact, if Donald Trump had not been the president, and if Donald Trump had not warned the Russian government, who warned the Syrian government, who warned the population that it was coming, there would have been mass casualties in that event. If Hillary Clinton had been the president of the United States at that time, there would have been mass casualties, there would have been Russian retaliation, and we might now be in the throes of literally a worldwide conflagration, including up to the use of nuclear weapons themselves. It doesn't get much more serious than that. And yet not one single parliamentarian, to my knowledge, has raised this subject in the House of Commons. Not one. And not one mainstream British media outlet has reported on Anonymous's revelation. Just think about that. That's the state that we are in, where our parliament is struck dumb, not censored, not forced, no threats required. Our parliament is literally dumb on an issue of this magnitude and this seriousness. And our media deliberately turns its face away. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry can summon journalists with a click of the finger, and even when they don't summon them, you will find acres of publicity about the latest maneuvers within the House of Windsor, or Love Island, or any one of 1,000 other frivolities are filling our media airwaves. But us spending at least scores of millions of pounds, maybe 100 million or more over a decade to give succor and comfort and strengthen the arm of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria is not worth a single article. I was going to say not even in The Guardian, but not would be entirely otiose. No Guardian, no Independent, no Mail, no BBC, no Channel 4 News, nothing. Absolute silence on a scandal of this magnitude. And some of it is comical, actually. There are documents in the documents, in the file of receipts, that make clear that gender sensitivity was insisted upon by the British government in handing over this money to people who were governing Idlib, murdering women accused of adultery, and throwing homosexuals off high buildings and murdering them in cold blood. In Idlib, where beheadings were and are routine, where people get their hand chopped off if caught smoking or petty pilfering. We were paying for the Idlib town council's media output, all of it. Its Facebook page, its Twitter handle, its newspapers, its radio output, its television output. And Idlib is still controlled by these very same head-chopping, throat-cutting, heart-eating mass murderers. And nobody in power, in parliament, in the media has anything at all to say about it. And it's left to Anonymous, and it's left to an American journalistic outfit, the Grey Zone Project, even to bring it to our attention. I'm glad to say that we had a super audience, as I say, almost 1 million, and it's only Tuesday, for last Sunday. So we have vastly increased, as we are doing now this evening, the knowledge and understanding of this story. But I don't want to stay on this story, because I want to draw conclusions from it that, if you like, are even more serious. We all know the propaganda that led to the Iraq War, both the first and the second, the babies in the incubators, the people being fed into shredding machines in Abu Ghraib prison, the sheer chamber of horrors conjured up by the war machine and its willing accomplices in the media in the run-up to both of these Iraq wars. We all know about them. And we all know that the propaganda offensive that led up to and accompanied the invasion by NATO of Libya, the richest country in Africa, now reduced literally to a slave market. We all remember, I hope, the stories credulously reported on the BBC, endlessly reported on the BBC, that Colonel Gaddafi had given his soldiers Viagra, the better for them to conduct mass rape as a weapon of war. We know that these were all perfect lies, by which I mean without even a kernel of truth. They were sheer invention by professional liars being paid for by British taxpayers' money. We know all of these things. So what's my point? My point is that this, therefore, must still be going on. Unless you imagine that some Damascene conversion took place over the last few months after the failure of the Syrian regime change operation, you must logically, it's not rocket science, you must infer that this is still going on. So where and about what is it still going on? And this is a warning to other people on the left who don't have the perspicacity of the leadership of the Workers' Party, who are led astray, no matter how many times they've been led astray before, led astray into the minefield of imperialist propaganda. If all those things happen that I've just described, and if it is a simple logical equation to infer that they are still happening, why do so many people fall for the lies that continue to be spun? And I don't have time to go through them all, and there is no need to. I'm going to concentrate on China, but I could bring in Russia, I could bring in Venezuela, I could bring in Iran, I could bring in North Korea, I could bring in many places, but I want to concentrate on the one that is both the greatest danger to world peace and is in the eye of the storm of war propaganda Inc. And that's China. China is under what in basketball they call a full court press, by which I mean every button is being pushed. Sometimes one is accentuated over the other. The conductor brings one part of the demonic orchestra into the forefront, and then another, and then back, and then another. And it depends on the prevailing conditions, the news agenda, events, paid for often by the Western, in this case, American mainly, but also British, paymasters of the propaganda incorporated. But they all have the same purpose, which is, if possible, to divide. If not possible to divide, then to weaken and slow the progress of China. There was a period of time, I'm sure the older among you can remember it well, when all of the Guardianista liberalati types were pro-Dalai Lama, Buddhists, chanting, yinging and yanging and ringing their bells. The fact that the Dalai Lama claimed to be the son of God was usually glossed over, because otherwise he'd sound like David Icke, and that wouldn't be a good look. The fact that Tibet had historically always been a part of China was equally glossed over. The fact that Tibet was being completely and utterly transformed for the better of all Tibetans could not be acknowledged or conceded. The fact that the economy, the social structures were being brought into the 20th century rather than the 14th or 15th, which is where they were before the Chinese Revolution, were all ignored. The fact that children could live long lives rather than nasty, short, and brutal ones, could have good food, good education, good houses, communications, bridges and roads, infrastructure of all kinds, that was all covered up. And the 1980s, I believe it was an era where everyone paid court at the feet of the Dalai Lama. We don't hear so much about him now, but there will be another one along anytime soon. Then there was a period where the Falun Gong were the principal section of the orchestra that could be heard, even though if they ever took hold in Britain, they would be promptly banned as an organization, a cult, much more cult-like than the Scientologists, much more pernicious than them. They were apparently being repressed in China. A cult, a black magic cult, was actually used and bolstered, promoted by Western-financed propaganda campaigns. Most recently, I saw one just yesterday, there's the absolute falsehood, series of falsehoods about China's treatment of the Christian churches inside China. Somebody claimed today that people under 18 are not allowed to attend Mass. Well, the last Mass I attended in China was absolutely full of school children. Pictures of the leader had to be placed inside the church. Well, that's true, but in the foyer. And that's common in many countries, perhaps even in some places our own. The fact that the people sing the national anthem in China was something they were being forced to do, when, of course, the Chinese are amongst the most patriotic people on the earth. And why would British people be complaining about other people singing their national anthem? Seems to happen rather often here too. There have been many others. Hong Kong is a well-trodden path. I don't need, because of its recency, dwell on it now. But not many people are left believing that the orgy of violence, burning, maiming, and murdering that took place over a period of 2 years on the streets of Hong Kong was not the product of the foreign interference, including interference from the countries whose flags were being flown. The clue was in the flags by the so-called protesters, who were in fact rioters. Now, all you need to do to get clubbed by the police in London is to stand in Trafalgar Square protesting about masks and COVID-19 restrictions. Some people seem to imagine that China is chock full of policemen. In fact, the number of policemen in China to the population by ratio is vastly less in China than it is, say, in the United States. Given how thinned out our own thin blue line is, it might be that there are as many Chinese policemen to 1 million Chinese people as there are in Britain, but no more than that. It's widely imagined that Chinese police officers carry guns, but they don't. It's one of the things they have in common with British police officers. The Chinese police are not armed routinely. Many of them, most of them, don't even have batons, truncheons. And so the events that happened in Trafalgar Square on Saturday would not happen ordinarily in China. But I'm leading up to the big enchilada, I hope. Though there are many others I could deal with. Taiwan, the South China Sea, and many others. But I want to leave time to talk about the big enchilada, the biggest hoax. Not in history, that would be the Iraqi WMD hoax, which has led to the demise, literally, of 1 million people and climbing. The destabilization of the world. It doesn't get much bigger as a hoax than that. But it's the biggest hoax of the last decade. And I refer to China's treatment of its Muslim minorities. Scores of them, by the way, not one. One of the characteristics of the old saw that a little knowledge is dangerous is that you reduce everybody and everything to the simple mantra that you heard on Sky News. There are some 70 Muslim minorities in China. But the one that they are all talking about now is the Uyghur population. And the lies are so childlike. It's a wonder that even in our perverse media, no one has tried to even subject them to a modicum of scrutiny. So let me do so, and may it travel far and wide. I read on the BBC website that you can be sent to a concentration camp for offences as trivial as possession of a Quran and a refusal to eat pork. I pointed out on Sunday that in Xinjiang province alone, and bear in mind there are 70 Muslim minority populations in China, but in Xinjiang province alone, where most of the Muslims are Uyghurs, there are more than 25,000 mosques. And in every one of those mosques, there's a mountain of Qurans. And in every one of those mosques, there are hundreds of people praying, none of whom have been eating pork. It is a bright, shining lie. In fact, there are 10 times more mosques in one province, Xinjiang, in China, than there are in the whole of the United States of America. So now that we've established that you cannot be sent to a concentration camp for the mere possession of a Quran, now that we've established that there's one mosque for every 536 Muslims in Xinjiang, which makes it the best provided country outside of Saudi Arabia for mosques as a proportion of the local Muslim population. Now that we've established that, let's move on to the bigger question of concentration camps. In Britain, we call them prisons, and we've got actually rather a lot of them. In America, they have even more. In fact, with 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners, the United States wins the Olympic gold medal for prisoners and prisons every day, all day. In fact, in America, they are turned to slave labor, the prison, corporate prison complex, where profitable private businesses are making super profits of the labor, super exploited labor of the prisoners that the prison system is being sent into. In Xinjiang, there are prisons. And in those prisons are convicted criminals. And some of those convicted criminals are members of the East Turkestan Liberation Front. In fact, the biggest camp full of them is in Idlib, that I just referred to, in ISIS and Al-Qaeda held and British and American protected occupied Syria. There are thousands of Uyghur fighters in Idlib and across the areas where the terrorist gangs have been murdering and maiming for this last decade in Syria. Actually, many of them, hundreds of them, have been sent to Libya to fight for Turkey's side in the multifaceted Libyan civil war. And some of them have just turned up on armored personnel carriers racing towards Nagorno-Karabakh, the disputed enclave in Azerbaijan, almost wholly populated by Armenians, and which very well might turn out now to be a new Syrian conflict. Uyghurs, by the dozen, have already been photographed, filmed, and interviewed, racing towards the conflict at Turkey's behest in Nagorno-Karabakh. But thousands of them, some 5,000 of them, are still in Syria. And there will be some thousands of them in the prison system in Xinjiang province in China. Not because they're Uyghurs, not because they are Muslims, but because they are activists for and some terrorists for the East Turkestan Liberation Movement, which seeks to break the province away from China and link up as, like Azerbaijan, another Turkic-speaking independent statelet dominated influenced and probably used by Turkey, NATO member Turkey. In fact, some of these prisoners have been subjected to what the Chinese call re-education. Now, I'm not a fan of re-education camps. I can think of examples where that kind of thing has been tried, which have stupendously backfired. But I suppose it's better to be in a re-education wing of a prison in China than it is to be droned, which is what, of course, would happen if the Muslims concerned were enemies rather than allies of the United States of America. If an Al-Qaeda affiliate, which it is, was active anywhere else, the United States might well be droning it, might well be drowning it in a hail of missiles, shot and shell fire. That's what America does with Muslim extremists that it doesn't like. The ones that it does like, of course, we've just talked about in relation to the Syria conflict. There are no concentration camps in China. So why have you been told by every single media outlet in Britain and repeatedly, and why have some of you fallen for it, that there are not just concentration camps, but there might be a million Uyghurs in them? It is a gigantic hoax. And it's brought to you by the very same people who brought you all the other hoaxes. And almost certainly when Anonymous dumps the receipts online sometime in the future, you'll discover that you were paying for all of that propaganda too. China is determined to crush Islamist fanaticism, which seeks to foment secession and division in its country. And that's their right. I dare say most of us would be equally determined. If a group of Islamic fundamentalist terrorists were at large in any country I know of, the state would seek to suppress and finally defeat them. And that is what China is trying to do. The point I'm making, therefore, in conclusion, is this. When the imperialist countries have an enemy, they have a motive and they have the means to mount psychological war against that enemy. And part of that psychological war against that enemy is exercised at home. It's a part and parcel of the psyop that you, the British public, should be persuaded of the ultimate importance, perhaps one day, of actual war against the enemy that has been identified. And short of war, all means necessary to divide, weaken, if possible, conquer that enemy that has been identified. And it's not as if we're short of examples. It's not as if we're short of experiences. It's not as if we don't know what was done in our name, on our dollar in the past. We know. So if we know, how come it's so difficult to persuade certain people, including people who regard themselves as being on the left, that this horse runs out of the same stable? The stable of misinformation, disinformation, psychological warfare. The British Army has set up a whole brigade called the 77th Brigade, whose weapons are laptops, to conduct psychological war against you and against the enemy abroad. And the Integrity Initiative and many other revelations shows that there's a whole army of so-called journalists, commentators, analysts, who are wittingly or unwittingly, paid or unpaid, soldiers in the army from hell, the army that lies to its own people. Thanks very much indeed for listening. Rob, I hope that went long enough. I'm not able to check the time. Yeah, 35 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, George. Excellent.
Thank you.
I will end tonight's broadcast.